Mhm. Gee. Hi, folks. If you'll excuse me for a moment, I will do a little sharing. Jesus. Hi, everybody. Sorry to take so long to start. I tried my best to be graceful at sharing, but I'm afraid I'm still very ham handed about that. Anyway, the topic for tonight is beyond by neoliberalism and violence in Bolivia. And what this is about is the struggle to get over neoliberalism and go on to something far better and more productive for all of us and for the earth we live on. So, in certain countries, we're beginning to get some success in getting through the struggle. We're beginning to overcome neoliberalism. At least it may look that way. In certain other countries, they've had some initial successes, but the neoliberals striking back with a vengeance. And in Bolivia, and in many countries in South America now, that is what is going on. There are protests, there's violence, and people are getting killed. And the worst of the outbreaks right now is in Bolivia, where, as you know, a coup has been ongoing. Some people think the coup is over and that it's been successful, but I think it remains to be seen whether the continuing struggle of the indigenous people in Bolivia is successful or not. So let's address some of our articles tonight that deal with these themes. The first of these, sorry about that screen there. The first of these is an article from International Politics and Society called Labor's Promise to Democratize. And it was written by Christine Berry, published on November 26th of 2019. I'll put it into clearly, as is my practice here, so you can see it better. I'll also enlarge the type so you can see the type a lot better. I'll also make sure that I'm there. Hi. And so, this article is about what's happening in the election campaign in the UK. As you know, when they have election campaigns there, the parties often put forward what they call a manifesto, which is a statement of the party platform. But basically, Labour published a manifesto on November 21st of 2019, building on its 2017 manifesto. That was wildly successful. It was rocking politics, in Britain, and helped Labour to defy expectations at the polls, says the article by Christine Berry. And of course, that was correct. That's exactly what happened, and Labour won a lot more seats than it was expected to win. Corbyn experienced some welcome success, but since that time, the stalemate over Brexit, in Parliament, has apparently been sapping the strength, of Labour. And as Barry says, this time around, the polls suggest that Labor again has a mountain to climb if it hopes to pull off the same feat as it did in 2017. But whether Labor wins or loses, the second second of the manifestos under Corbyn may yet become a defining document for those seeking to shape a new consensus beyond neoliberalism. In other words, she's saying this may prove a model not just for the UK, but also for a lot of other countries in the Western world, okay, as well. In the 2.5 years since the 2017 election, she says, have not been wasted. This is a deeper, more sophisticated, or more radical set of policies than the one that came before. Like in 2017, the British establishment is once again working hard to dismiss Labour's spending plans as fantasy economics or a return to the 1970s. But the real story of Labour's platform or the manifesto does not lie in its fiscal policy, which is scarcely out of line with many major European economies. Rather, it lies in the fruition of sustained policy development work in partnership with left-wing intellectuals and social movements. The question it seeks to answer is, how can we build a democratic and sustainable economy? And the answer, I think, as Barry would summarize it, is finance for the many. She says, for perhaps the first time in the party's history, tackling the climate emergency is being placed at the heart of Labour's program, with plans for a green industrial industrial revolution, unquote, to decarbonize the economy and create hundreds of thousands of green jobs. So far, so necessary. But Labour is promising more than a massive increase in investment. Its true radicalism lies in how this investment would be delivered. The aim is to radically democratize and decentralize the British economy through new public and cooperatively owned institutions. Thinkers Joe Guinan, okay, and Martin O'Neill have dubbed this Labour's, quote, institutional turn, unquote. For instance, Labour has committed to establish a new public banking system with a national investment bank, supported by a localized post-bank network offering basic banking services and small business loans. Full disclosure, I worked on a recent report for the party which developed by these proposals. Hang on just a second while I check on something, please. Thank you. Oh, sorry. You can't see the page anymore, can you? I shall fix that. Matter of fact, I don't know why you can't see the page anymore. You should be able to. It seems to be fine there. Okay. Meanwhile, let me see what's going on elsewhere. I just wanted to make sure there was no echo here because I realized I'd forgotten to correct for it. Hi, Dale. Hi, Dolores. Hi, Jeff Denton. Hi, Bonnie. Okay, so Back to the article. For instance, Labor has committed to establish a new public banking system with a national investment bank supported by a localized post-bank network offering basic banking services and small business loans. Full disclosure, says Christine Berry, I worked on a recent report for the party which developed these proposals. And she quotes, the UK left would therefore benefit greatly from more sustained international dialogue with European progressives in order to understand the limitations of these models and the latest thinking on how they can be improved. The party is also beginning to think about new approaches to monetary policy and to regulation, which can shape the credit creation of private banks in socially and ecologically beneficial ways. This is the most coherent, potentially transformative approach to banking and finance offered by any British political party in my lifetime, she says. 10 years after the financial crisis, it offers a response to the UK's key economic economic malaise, a bloated, speculative city of London, which fails to invest in productive and sustainable activity. For Labour's international allies, it is worth noting that much of this policy platform has been inspired by continental Europe. For instance, the German public banking system has been an explicit role model for the development of Labour policy in this area. The same is true of plans to boost the municipal and community ownership of energy. This builds on the German Energiewende, quote unquote, and the success of countries like Denmark in promoting decentralized, democratic, renewable energy. To the extent, therefore, a Labour victory would simply mean the UK rejoining the European social democratic mainstream. For the poster child, okay, of neoliberalism, this would be no small achievement. In other words, she's saying, okay, the Labour Party, well, maybe it was the UK that was the poster child that she's referring to here, but for a while, the Labour Party, in a way, was the poster child, having converted to neoliberalism for some time. But a victory, okay, in this election for Corbyn would certainly mean moving away from the neoliberal model because Corbyn is no neoliberal. Barry says our aspirations as a movement, however, stretch further. The UK left would therefore benefit greatly from more sustained international dialogue with the European progressives in order to understand the limitations of these models and the latest thinking on how they can be improved. One way Labour is trying to do this is by extending the principles of democratic ownership and control of key infrastructure into new areas. The party's flagship policy to roll out a universal free public broadband is a case in point. It is not simply a shiny election giveaway, but has been chosen to represent the party's core offer to democratize the economy whilst also modernizing it. Labour wishes to counter the accusation that is harking back to a vanished past and instead reinvent democratic socialism for the future. This means asking, what are the, quote, commanding heights, unquote, of today's economy? Just as the railroads and waterways were the critical infrastructure of the 19th century, so the internet and the banking system are the critical infrastructure of the 21st. Finding new ways to collectivize control of these systems is key to the Corbynite political project. And she quotes again from her own work. Ultimately, what's most exciting about Labor's 2019 manifesto is not what's in it, but what sits behind it. Labor is also moving beyond an expansion of public ownership to thinking more deeply about how to democratize the private sector. Its approach to this problem can be summed up in three flagship policies. First, the proposal to require large companies to transfer shares into inclusive ownership funds, IOFs, they're called, controlled collectively by their workers. This is inspired by the by Swedish the Meidner Plan and aims to facilitate a gradual transition from shareholder capitalism to employee ownership. Second, a new cooperative development agency with a mission to double the size of the cooperative sector. So first, the IOFs, and second, okay, a new cooperative development agency trying to double the size of the cooperative sector. Third, promoting community wealth building, quote unquote, an approach pioneered by the Preston City Council to keep public money circulating in the local economy by supporting local and community owned businesses. Of course, this is also consistent with the Green New Deal approach as well, which is all about strengthening local economies through local projects supported by a job guarantee. Though there's no job guarantee yet specified for the UK by the labor rights, not yet. Finally, mention must go to the party's promise to phase in a 4-day working week by 2030, perhaps one of its most radical pledges of all. With this, Labor hopes to become the heir of previous struggles to limit working hours, such as the fight for an 8-hour day or paid holidays. A shorter working week has long been advocated by radical left thinkers from many perspectives. Environmentalists, actually believe it would help tackle the ecological crisis by using improvements in productivity to expand leisure time rather than to expand economic activity. Feminists hope it will help to equalize and value domestic labor and care work, along with moves towards by universal basic services such as free buses, childcare, and broadband. This reflects a key strand of labor's thinking. It aims not only to democratize the market economy by expanding public and cooperative ownership, but also to restrict the reach of the market economy by expanding our ability to meet our needs outside of it. Ultimately, what's most exciting about Labor's 2019 manifesto is not what's in it, but what sits behind it. Policies on issues ranging from rent control to access to medicines have been adopted directly from social movements and campaigns. The Labor membership has taken the lead in pushing the party's policies further at its annual conference, from extending free movement to abolishing private schools. Policy reports have been commissioned from some of the leading thinkers on the UK left, such as, quote, land for the many, unquote, which sets out a vision to radically democratize the ownership and use of land. Not all of this has made its way into the manifesto, but it indicates a depth of thinking and mobilization on the UK left that simply did not exist even 2 years ago. Whatever the result of this election, this offers hope. A new political settlement is being shaped from the bottom up. Corbynism's early promise to democratize politics within the labor movement is being fulfilled. We can only hope it will be able to do the same for the UK. Yes, I certainly hope so. One big thing standing in the way, though, with respect to the UK, is that So much of the attention of the people in this election in the UK is focused on the Brexit issue, whether they're going to have Brexit or they're not going to have Brexit. Okay, it is very difficult also for Labour to come down on the Brexit side. Okay, the reason being that the Scottish National Party wants to stay in the EU. They are committed to remaining in the EU and have even threatened to secede from the UK, okay, if there is Brexit. And they're the party there is very strongly opposed, and the First Minister of Scotland also is very strongly opposed to Brexit and very strongly opposed to Johnson, the Tory candidate for Prime Minister. Okay, and so if Bojo wins, there's a possibility of a split. If Corbyn wins, then with the help of the Scots, he may be able to form a government. But if he's able to form that government, the question is, can he bring along the people within his own party who are committed to Brexit because they interpret that as the will of the people that arose in the referendum about 2 years ago? So that's the problem. The question is, will the Labour Party go along with the referendum or not? Corbyn's been trying to walk a fine line, and as a result, his position is clear to no one, and the position of the Labour Party is also clear to no one. Okay, the Labour Party has been trying to square the circle there, and what they've basically been saying is that they're probably going to support a new referendum if Corbyn gets into power. Okay, and they think the will of the people may have changed since the first of the referendums. So that remains to be seen. If it has changed, okay, then perhaps the people can get behind the election, of Corbyn and defeat the Tories. But at the same time, on the possibility of that happening hangs the new radical program, of Labour. If they're to get that program through, which will be very important for the rest of the Western world, at least, including the United States, and perhaps as well for many of the developing nations, then somehow the Brexit issue is going to have to be finessed. Okay. And thus far, it doesn't seem like Corbyn is having a lot of success, in doing that. But the elections there are on a very short timeline. I believe this election is coming up December 11th. Opinions change in the UK. Around election time in these very short elections, they can change radically. In just a few days, but there are only now I guess about 11 days left, until election day in the UK. I forgot now, maybe December 11th, and maybe December 20th, in which case there are a few more days still. I'm not actually certain actually when election day is there, but someone can tell me in the comments. Anyway, The struggle against the neoliberals continues here in the United States. Of course, one mark of this is the Bernie Sanders campaign and the Green New Deal, okay, and Medicare for All, and all the other things promised by Bernie, including the expansion of uh, the internet, okay, broadband to rural areas. Uh, Also, an aggressive program to increase cooperative ownership in the United States, and the role, okay, of unions in the Sanders campaign, and a lot more public ownership of things, as in a very favorable stance towards the public banking movement, which is also in the Sanders program. So, uh, Sanders campaign platform, also a struggle against the neoliberals. Okay, but one important area that represents a dimension of this struggle is in foreign policy. And we see in the context of the elections about 3 New York races, a long-standing policy of the neoliberals, that is, a right-wing consensus, okay, on Israel, faces a reckoning in 3 New York congressional races. That's the title of an article from The Intercept by Alex Kane. The article was written on November 25th. And here you see a photo, okay, of Elliot Engel talking to Jerry Nadler following a news conference at the U.S. Capitol on June 11th of 2019. I'll put this on clearly and we'll go over the article. In May of 2018, Ivanka Trump celebrated the U.S. Embassy opening in Jerusalem against the backdrop of Israeli troops gunning down 60 Palestinians in Gaza. Some quarters of the Democratic Party, the killings were sharply condemned. One of the condemners, okay, was Representative John Yarmuth, who's a Democrat from Kentucky. Yarmuth called the shootings, quote, horrific slaughter, unquote, and added, quote, we're witnessing the use of unabated brutality and force against civilians to stifle civil unrest, unquote. A more justifiable comment has never been made. Other Democrats, however, reacted much differently. Okay? Among them was Elliot Engel, a 30-year member of Congress from New York. He applauded Donald Trump's move to break with decades of U.S. policy and effectively recognize full Israeli control of Jerusalem, a city whose Palestinian eastern half is under military occupation. This move is long overdue, Engel said in a statement, quote again, and I look forward to visiting, unquote. He did not mention the scores of Palestinians slain by Israeli soldiers on the same day as the embassy opening. Scores! 60 people or more killed. The statement, in its praise for Israel and lack of concern for Palestinian human rights, was classic Engel rhetoric. Engel, who chairs the House Foreign Affairs Committee, is one of the most pro-Israel hawks in the House of Representatives. His alignment with the right wing on Israel is increasingly out of step with a Democratic base that is younger, more diverse, and more willing to call out Israel for its violations of international law. By U.S. military aid to Israel is no longer being accepted without question. A Center for American Progress poll released this year found that 71% of Democrats support conditioning aid to Israel if the Jewish state, that's conditioning aid to Israel, placing conditions on it, if the Jewish state continues to build illegal settlements on Palestinian land. And a Data for Progress poll found something similar. 64% of Democrats support reducing aid to Israel over human rights abuses. Quote, there are issues that divide the leadership of the party from the base. A lot of which is also generational. You see it on healthcare, you see it on climate, you see it on criminal justice, you see it on immigration, said Waleed Shahid, Communications Director for Justice Democrats, a group that backs primary challenges to establishment of Democrats, including a challenge to Engel. Quote, over the past 2 years, you've begun to see it on foreign policy, most specifically around Israel-Palestine, unquote. Now heading into the 2020 election, Engel is one of 3 staunchly pro-Israel members of New York's congressional delegation who may, or in one case will definitely, be replaced in 2021, creating an opportunity for pro-Palestinian advocates on Capitol Hill. In New York's 16th congressional district, which stretches from the Tony suburbs of Scarsdale to the busy streets of the Bronx, Engel is facing a spirited primary challenge from 2 insurgent Democrats, Andom Georgis and Jamal Bowman, both of whom are critical of Israel's human rights record and Engel's positions on Israel. Quote, a Congress without the 3 of them would have a big impact, unquote. I'm not sure who was being quoted there. Jerry Nadler, chair of the House Judiciary Committee, who represents the 10th District. I should add here that Jerry Nadler, as the chair of the Judiciary Committee in the House, is now the leader in the impeachment proceedings in the House going on right now. Is also facing a primary from the left by Lindsey Boylan, a former New York State economic official. Okay, and also Nita Lowey, chair of the House Appropriations Committee, announced her retirement from her 17th district seat in October, and Mondaire Jones is running on a progressive platform to replace her. But New York Democrats go to the polls for primaries on June 23rd, 2020. So at the end of those primaries, we'll know who the nominees will be and whether the neoliberals survive. It seems clear now that Nita Lowey is going to be gone, and Mondaire Jones is not a neoliberal. That is, he's running on a progressive type of platform to begin with. Whether Jerry Nadler gets replaced, Eliot Engel gets replaced, we don't know. All 3 Jewish lawmakers have played key roles in building the Washington Consensus on Israel. And Engel and Lowey in particular have been helped by millions of dollars in campaign contributions from pro-Israel lobby groups and the weapons industry. They rose to power in an age when Israel was seen principally as a post-Holocaust haven for Jews, an indispensable U.S. ally, and a democracy. and they represent districts with substantial populations, of Jewish Americans who share these views. I'm of course one Jewish American who doesn't share these views at the present time. The early state of Israel was supposed to be a democracy, and as such was supposed to be a respecter of the human rights, of the Arabs. Israeli policy, though, since the mid-70s, has been taking a severe turn towards the right and has increasingly gotten more and more hostile to the human rights, of Arabs. And the point has come where that's actually opposed by a majority of American Jews at this point in time. Anyway, as a result, they've spent their long careers ensuring that Israel receives billions of dollars in U.S. military aid and criticizing efforts to hold Israel accountable for human rights abuses. Engel, Nadler, and Lowy's offices did not respond to requests for comment for this article. If the members lose their seats, the Democratic leadership will likely appoint other pro-Israel Democrats as their replacements to head powerful committees like Foreign Affairs and Appropriations. Still, because of the influence Engel, Nadler, and Lowy wield on congressional Israel policy, their exit from Congress would give the Palestinian rights movement a bigger opportunity to press its agenda on Capitol Hill, particularly around conditioning the military aid from the U.S. to Israel to ensure that aid does not get used by the military in Israel to commit human rights abuses and to beat back attacks on boycott, divestment and sanctions, or BDS, the nonviolent movement to pressure Israel to end its human rights violations against Palestinians. And quote, a Congress without the three of them would have a big impact, said Beth Miller, Government Affairs Manager for Jewish Voice for Peace Action. The electoral campaign arm of Palestine, a solidarity group, but Jewish Voice for Peace. It just so happens, I don't know if they have anything at all to do, with Beth Miller, but it just so happens that on one side of my family there are Millers, and I grew up among those Millers. Quote, it would open opportunities to center human rights in the conversation. So when we're talking about Israel and Palestine, we're talking about human rights and justice, and not other concerns that those three insert to get away from talking about human rights. Unquote. Engel is one of the Democratic Party's most powerful foreign policy voices. First elected to Congress in 1988. He has served on the House Foreign Affairs Committee since 1994. In 2012, he became the ranking Democratic person on that committee, and this year, after Democrats took control of the House, Engel became chair. There was recently voiced support for progressive domestic policies. He signed on to the Green New Deal and joined the newly formed the Medicare for All caucus. He has consistently advanced the right-wing agenda on Israel. He's long said he does not believe that Israel's settlements built on Palestinian land in violation of international law pose an obstacle to peace. In 2014, as Israel's army was in the middle of a punishing assault on Gaza that ultimately killed 500 children. Engels spoke at a New York rally boosting Israel's operation. Pamela Geller, a vociferously anti-Muslim activist, I'd say a notoriously anti-Muslim activist, spoke at the same rally. Earlier this year, Engels spoke at a Capitol Hill event sponsored by the Zionist Organization of America, a far-right group helmed by Mort Klein, who has come under fierce criticism for racist comments about black people, okay, and Arabs, unquote. When I was a boy, my parents fundraised for the Zionist Organization of America as volunteers, okay, not as staff, okay, or anything like that. They were very devoted to the organization, though. My father, in particular, was. In my family, however, at that time, back in the 1940s and 1950s, okay, and 1960s, there was no room for racist comments concerning either black people or Arabs. It was unknown, okay, in my family until one of my uncles actually began to give voice to attitudes, okay, of that sort. He was not encouraged by the other members of the family, okay, at all. Okay, he was a veteran of the Second World War, but there were two other members of the family, okay, who were also veterans, okay, of the Second World War. One of them, his brother, who died in the Second World War, uh, who was fiercely opposed to discrimination, okay, of any kind, would have been horrified at the attitudes that his brother began to express in the 1960s and 1970s, okay, and following years. And those kinds of attitudes were very fiercely exposed by his sister, okay, who was the other veteran, okay, of World War II in the family. Anyway, move on. Quote, Eliot is arguably the best friend to U.S.-Israel relations, okay, and Israel. He's the best friend among the Democrats, Klein told The Intercept. And then there's a quote from Morton Klein there. While Engels supports a two-state solution, a Palestinian state, okay, alongside Israel as a way to solve the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. In 1990, he authored some legislation that would put Congress on record as endorsing Israeli control over all of Jerusalem. That precludes the possibility that Palestinians would use East Jerusalem as its capital, something that would be key to a viable Palestinian state. Yes, absolutely, it would. In modern times, the Old City has been the center of the Arab population in the city, okay, of Jerusalem, while the newer city has been the center, of Jewish population in Jerusalem. And it always seemed to me from the 70s on that the fairest solution would be to make Jerusalem, a dual capital, with the Arabs having their capital in the eastern part, and the Israelis having their capital in the new city. That, however, was not enough for some of the extreme Zionists who seem to have taken over in Israel now. In 2004, Engel led a group of congressional Democrats and Republicans in calling for a suspension of U.S. aid to UNRWA, the UN Agency for Palestinian for refugees, Palestinian refugees, because the agency had acknowledged that Hamas members were on its payroll. Such aid cuts, which Trump enacted 15 years later, pose a serious threat to Palestinian access to health care and schooling. I don't think the Palestinians have much access right now to health care and schooling. I think that's been stopped by the Israelis in various ways. Anyway, which UNRWA provides to some of the most impoverished, of the Palestinians. Yes, it does, and has for a long time. So among the 21 other Democrat signatories on that letter were two New York representatives who today are considered to be by staunch liberals. One, is Nita Lowey, and the other Jerry Nadler. Lowey and Engel have teamed up on other pro-Israel initiatives. In 2015, they co-sponsored, along with Republican representatives Ed Royce and Peter Roskam, a resolution decrying the EU's efforts to accurately label Israeli products from the occupied West Bank as settlement products. Lowey also supported Trump's embassy move. Lowey, but not Jerry Nadler. Quote, there may still be some hope for Jerry yet. Quote, their roles cannot be understated. They're not only supportive of Israel, but in positions of power where that support can be translated into action, said Haley Seufer, who's the executive director of the Jewish Democratic Council of America. Lowey's impact has been felt most on the House Appropriations Committee, on which she has been the ranking Democrat since 2013 and became chair this year. And the Hawatch, the U.S. has appropriated billions of dollars in unconditional military aid to Israel, as well as hundreds of millions of dollars in security assistance for the Palestinian Authority, which has used the money to create a police state bent on crushing dissent and cracking down on Palestinian armed action against Israel. When Lowey announced that she would retire in 2020, she got a personal shout-out from the Israeli Prime Minister's office on Twitter, quote, on behalf of the State of Israel and the Jewish people, unquote. But Benjamin Netanyahu tweeted, quote again, I would like to thank you for decades of dedicated public service and for your steadfast support for Israel, unquote. Like Engel, Lowey voted against President Obama's nuclear deal with Iran. God forbid there should be peace with Iran. Siding with the GOP, and Netanyahu against our own party leader's signature foreign policy effort. Nadler has taken a somewhat different tack on foreign policy than Engel and Lowy. While he's a staunch supporter of the U.S. Israel relationship, he broke from his New York colleagues by voting against the Iraq War, which Engel and Lowy supported, and for the Iran deal. So, in other words, what Nadler is showing that he's a peacenik to a greater extent than Engel, okay, and Lowy, okay, and less of a Cold War Democrat. Still, Jerry Nadler has taken a hard line on efforts to condemn Israel for settlement building. In 2016, he condemned Obama's decision to abstain from voting on a UN resolution decrying Israeli settlements as illegal under international under under international law. And I might add, they are illegal under international law. And this year, he was a lead Democratic co-sponsor on a House resolution condemning the BDS movement. That resolution, which falsely linked the BDS movement to anti-Semitism, passed by a 398 to 17 margin. As Palestinian rights advocates try to push their legislation on Capitol Hill, members of Congress often cite Nadler and Lowy as reasons they cannot sponsor a particular bill, said Brad Parker, senior advisor on policy and advocacy to Defense Children International Palestine. He spent the last 6 months advocating for members of Congress to sign on to Betty McCollum's bill. Okay, I'm going to skip ahead now. You're getting the picture with respect to how important Engel and Nadler and Lowy have been to having Congress give its unqualified support to the right wing, okay, in Israel, and how important they've also been in going against the majority opinion, okay, of American Jews, which now favor very explicit recognition of the rights of the Palestinians, and which now are opposed to the right wing, okay, in Israel very strongly. But Jamal Bowman, who was a middle school principal, okay, in the Bronx, known for his education, activism, is forcing Engel to take the 2020 race seriously. The day after the Data for Progress poll was published, Engel sent out a fundraising letter to supporters, calling his opponents special interests, quote unquote, trying to divide the Democratic Party. Now, that's certainly the pot calling the kettle black. Bowman has been endorsed by Justice Democrats and Brand New Congress, groups that made their names backing Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, along with the Environmental 350 Action, and former gubernatorial candidates Zephyr Teachout and Cynthia Nixon. He's raised $190,000 to Engel's $566,000. In that New York context, that's pretty competitive, mostly in small dollar donations, and has rejected taking corporate PAC money. Bowman's path to victory will require turning out new voters in a district that had about a 10% turnout in the 2018 primary race. So that's a district that could be delivering a surprise. There was a similar situation in Ocasio-Cortez's district, and a similar, well, it wasn't even a similar fundraising gap. The fundraising gap in Ocasio-Cortez's case was near 10 to 1. Here, the fundraising gap with respect to Engel and Bowman is only 3 to 1. So Bowman plans to do outreach in minority communities, which make up over half of the district's population, and peel off votes in some areas that could be considered Engel territory, as in the Riverdale area of the Bronx. That's an enclave with a large Jewish community. The voters in Riverdale were key to Alessandra Biaggi's upset win over State Senator Jeff Kline in 2018. So the Biaggi supporters successfully painted Kline, who caucused with the GOP in Albany as part of the Independent Democratic Conference, as someone who advanced the right-wing agenda, a message that Engel's prime opponents are echoing in pointing out his coziness, his support for military intervention in the Middle East, and his coziness with Netanyahu. Bowman is running on a message of change, actually progressive change, endorsing Medicare for All and the Green New Deal, and telling voters he will fight to end the crises of poverty and opioid addiction in his district. He says that while Engel has sat comfortable, taking hundreds of thousands in campaign donations from weapons companies, his district has suffered. Bowman has also set himself apart from Engel on the Mideast conflict. He supports imposing human rights conditions on military funding for Israel, echoing a policy position that Senator Bernie Sanders has repeatedly amplified on the presidential trail, and making sure that the U.S. is enforcing the Leahy Law, which prohibits sending military aid to foreign security units that abuse human rights on Israel. Okay, he wants to enforce the law, on Israel. In other words. In an interview with Jacobin, Bowman indicated support for the McCollum bill, saying, quote, "I just don't understand why American taxpayers are subsidizing the detention of Palestinian children while Democrats are criticizing child detention at our southern border with Mexico." And just for the record, I don't understand that either. And quote again from Bowman, Engel has not been calling out Netanyahu with some of his policies as they move to the right and have been more destructive in that region. Engel hasn't really held Netanyahu accountable, unquote, said Bowman to The Intercept. He also said he disagrees with Congress passing any legislation that would impose penalties on supporters of the BDS movement. Though he does not support the BDS, he considers it a form of free speech, he said. So he supports the BDS on free speech grounds. So do I. And by Georgios, hard name to pronounce. Engels, a second progressive challenger, okay, is an Eritrean American who goes even further than Bowman on Israel. Georgios, who has spent time in the occupied West Bank teaching English, is a supporter of the BDS movement and a former member of Yale's chapter of Students for Justice in Palestine, the flagship pro-Palestinian campus group. Georgios doesn't see problems in Israel as reducible to Netanyahu. He told The Intercept that Israel's policies of settlement building, expansion into Palestinian territory, and occupation are, quote, something that has been part of Israel's institutional fabric. Yes, since at least the middle 1970s, that has been true. Now, occupation came actually before that, but supposedly at first it was to be a temporary occupation, with Israel recognizing that it was occupying parts of Palestine, not part of the Jewish state. And in that initial posture, there was no room for annexation, which is what the Israelis are talking about right now. Georgios, however, has raised nearly 70 to 120,000 less than Bowman and has not garnered any big name support on the progressive side, though he has been endorsed by the group People for Bernie. Lindsey Boylan, the former chief of staff for New York's economic development arm, now gunning for Nadler's seat, has staked out similar positions to Bowman as she runs in the congressional district with the most Jews in the country. In her first extensive remarks on Israel with a news outlet, Boylan told The Intercept that she supports imposing conditions on U.S. military aid to Israel, which is a policy Nadler said was wrong in early November. He was quoted as saying it was wrong, quote, unquote. Quote again, as a good friend would, we have to be able to say, quote, you could not use military aid against children. You cannot use military aid to further the cause of annexation in the West Bank, unquote. We have to be willing and open to those conversations, unquote again. Boylan said before adding that Israel policy toward Gaza, quote, known as an open-air prison, unquote, is, quote, never going to produce safety for everyday Israelis, unquote. Okay, Mondaire Jones, the former Obama administration lawyer, whose pro-Green New Deal and Medicare for All positions have garnered the most excitement, okay, among the progressives in his district. Sorry, I'm having trouble scrolling this. Believes there's a human rights crisis in the occupied Palestinian territories. He did not give a straight answer and instead decried humanitarian conditions there. I don't think I read that right because of the scrolling problem. Let me see if I can get that under control. He's taken a far more cautious stance than the other insurgents challenging the pro-Israel stalwarts. He told The Intercept he did not get in the race to challenge Lowy's foreign policy stances, has not studied her record on Israel, and does not currently support imposing conditions on U.S. military aid to Israel. Asked by The Intercept about whether he believes there's a human rights crisis in the occupied Palestinian territories, he did not give a straight answer, and instead he decried the humanitarian conditions there. He said, so he's trying to straddle the fence on this one. He also said he had no problem with the House condemning the BDS movement, calling the vote an exercise in free speech, much as advocating the boycott of Israel is. Still, Jones, who would make history as the first black and openly gay member of Congress, did stake out some positions that were to the left of Lowy's in an interview with The Intercept. He said he supported the Iran deal from the outset. Lowy opposed it and praised Netanyahu's 2015 speech to Congress to torpedo Obama's signature foreign policy achievement. Okay, in other words, that's what Lowy did. And what Mondaire Jones did is to say no to saying U.S. tax dollars should be used by Israel in any future annexation of the occupied West Bank. So he's really straddling. For pro-Israel advocates, the primary races and Lowy's retirement are a troubling sign for the future of the Democratic Party, and pro-Israel lobby groups are now beginning to back their favorite incumbents for next year's primary race. Already this election cycle, NORPAC, one of the most well-funded Israel lobby groups in the country, has given Engel nearly $40,000. It's the largest donation to any House member. Quote, there's limited history scrolling problem again. Let me just wait to clear up for a second. Almost done with this article. There's limited history between newcomers, the new people we're sending to power, and Jews in the state of Israel, unquote, said Hank Scheinkoff, a longtime Democratic consultant and pro-Israel advocate. Scheinkoff was a very well-known supporter of Hillary Clinton, by the way. Quote, if you look at demographic shifts, everybody should be concerned. And the loss of any of those three would be likely a tremendous loss for the pro-Israel community. Unquote. Well, it looks like the leading candidate in Lowy's district, is actually Mondaire Jones. So at least he's going to be replacing one of them. And it looks like Engel has his hands full, though the progressive vote could be split actually between the two progressive candidates. But Jamal Bowman looks like by far the strongest of the two at this point. As for Boylan, it remains to be seen what she can do with Jerry Nadler. He's been more liberal than the others, on a number of issues, and also more to the center as opposed to supporting the right wing when it comes to Israel as well. So if he does well in the impeachment hearings, he may be the most difficult one of the three to replace. But it's possible that Engel could take a hit. Okay, at this point, it's possible that Nadler could also take a hit. If either or both of those should happen, and if Mondaire Jones should win, that would be a good thing for Palestinian rights and a good thing for the end, okay, of neoliberal foreign policy in Israel. So, the items on the Bolivian coup. Next. Story appeared on November 27th, 2019, in an article by Olivia, that's her last name, okay, is Arrigo Styles. And she reports, okay, on how the Bolivian police gassed a funeral march in the latest crackdown. And this appeared in Counterpunch. There's a picture of the protest there, which the indigenous people tried to make as peacefully, okay, as possible. Last Thursday, thousands of people descended into La Paz from El Alto, which is the suburb. It's the working class suburb where the people come into La Paz to work. It's a much poorer area and filled with the indigenous working class that serves the more middle class and upper class people in La Paz. They came in carrying the caskets of 8 people who were shot dead by police earlier that week. Emotions were running high, and protesters had tears streaming down their faces. They assembled peacefully to demand justice. Quote, Anya's murderer. We want your resignation, unquote, they shouted. Quote again, Justicia, unquote. It was not a march in support of a political party. It was a march of grief and fury. Around 30 minutes later, the police dropped cans of tear gas over the marchers, forcing the families to abandon the coffins on the ground under the hot sun. As the tear gas floated across the plaza, San Francisco, the people implored, quote, calma, calma, unquote, to prevent a crush as the crowd fled. The dead had been among those blockading the natural gas plant at Sincata, El Alto, in protest at the new interim government. In total, 9 were shot by state forces on Tuesday in a military operation to unblock the plant, which supplies most of La Paz's gas. The Inter-American Commission on Human Rights this week convened open meetings across Bolivia to assess the current human rights situation. At one, a woman described how her husband was not involved directly in the Sencata blockade, but was shot by the military, quote, like a dog in the street, unquote. The protest on Thursday comes as Bolivia enters a deep impasse following the removal of former President Evo Morales, the country's first indigenous leader. The present juncture is marked by institutional breakdown and by political reprisals and near unprecedented state violence. The week before, 8 cocoleros, cocoa growers, were massacred by state security forces as they protested against the new government in Sacaba, Cochabamba, which is a province uh, in Bolivia. According to Bolivian human rights organization CIDOB, SIDOB, there have been 32 people killed and 700 injured in the several weeks of unrest which engulfed the country after the elections on October 20th. Speaking to some at the protests, many fear the unofficial count is higher. Security forces have impunity under the government after the new government passed a decree which exempts them from criminal responsibility when using force. So they can kill people at will and they're unaccountable. On Thursday, there was a sizable contingent of students from the Universidad uh, 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 from the uh, the Universidad Mayor de San Andres, the UMSA, the main public university in La Paz, who formed a human chain to pass water to the protesters. This marks a shift from previous anti-coup marches in which the university students as a bloc were largely absent. Under the leadership of opposition supporting uh, uh, Rector Waldo Albarracin, the UMSA has been a nexus for anti-Morales activity. And in the 2 weeks after the elections, the UMSA students were key instigators of anti-Morales um, 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 anti-Morales blockades. But these students shouted, "Fascistas no pasaron," unquote, indicating the violence of the post-coup government may have provoked a volte face, which is an about face, of course. Meanwhile, the government, headed by religious conservatives, Janine Áñez, continues its McCarthy-esque purge of officials appointed under the Movimiento al Socialismo, the MAS, issuing highly politicized and seemingly arbitrary arrest warrants. It should be remembered that Áñez's party only received 4% of the popular vote in the election. So the new president of the country is the head of a party that only received 4% of the popular vote, okay, in the election. And the person who received 47%, okay, of the popular vote, but who lost the support, okay, of the military, has had to flee the country, okay, and go to Mexico. Wonderful, right? It is clear that the scale of the new government's clampdown far exceeds the mandate, okay, for an interim government. Friday, the new government, okay, the new minister of government, Arturo um, um, okay, his name is Arturo um, 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 has issued an arrest warrant against Evo Morales and former minister Juan Ramon Quintana for, quote, sedition and terrorism, and promised that he would be seeking the maximum sentence of 30 years in prison. This follows the circulation of an audio recording apparently between Evo Morales and the Cocolero leader, but Faustino Ucrayarwi, in which Evo Morales is heard ordering the blocking of food entering La Paz. The recording has not been independently verified, Evo Morales is currently in political exile in Mexico. But it is not only Morales and the high-profile Marxistas who have been targeted. Trade unions, mayors, uh, um, 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 but and also local officials linked to the MAS have faced threats and reprisals, and in some cases, arrest warrants. Also, officials have had their houses burnt down. The heads of both chambers of government were forced to resign after threats of violence. This week, the state attorney general also announced an arrest warrant for Nicolas Laguna, the former director of the digital communications agency known as JEDIC. He is wanted as part of an investigation of alleged electoral fraud in the elections of October 20th. Evo Morales first took power in 2006 with his social movement-backed party, the MAS. His resignation on November 10th came after the head of the Bolivian armed forces suggested that he resigned, suggested, quote unquote, that he resigned following a mutiny by police in cities across the country. This followed 2 weeks of mobilization by anti government protesters over accusations of fraud in the elections on October 20th. It also coincided with the release of the report by the Organization of American States, which suggested that there had been actual manipulation, quote unquote, in the vote count. These allegations of fraud have been contested by U.S. think tank, the Center for Economic and Policy Research, the CEPR, which, by the way, is made up of very honest people. Many of the blockades across the country have now lifted after negotiations with the government and protesters, but La Paz and other cities are still experiencing food and gas shortages and food price increases. There are long queues to buy bread, chicken, eggs, and petrol, amongst other items, and chicken has been rationed to avoid speculation. On Saturday, the government arranged for 12 tons of meat to arrive by air in El Alto to circumvent the blockades. On Friday, there were confrontations at a landfill site in Caracara and Cochabamba, which had been the site of several protests. 26 soldiers were reportedly injured as they attempted to unblock the dump. However, there are signs that an uneasy détente may have been reached. On Saturday night, the political parties in the legislature agreed for new elections to take place, which was ratified by Agnes on Sunday. There will be a new electoral court within 20 days, and following that, elections within 120 days, in which neither Morales nor ex-vice president Alvaro Garcia Linera will be permitted to run, but his families mourn those assassinated by the state, and with the country enveloped in fear and repression, and enduring political settlement looks unlikely. Okay, and Olivia Arrigo Stiles is a PhD candidate at the University of Essex, researching indigenous mobilization in 20th century Bolivia. She's also a contributing editor of El Barata magazine. So, a pretty authoritative article by someone quite familiar with the situation there. And next, and finally, an article in Truth Out. The U.S. is again complicit, in an illegal coup. What else is new, right? This time in Bolivia. There's a picture, of Evo. And this was written by Marjorie Cohn, of Truth Out, on November 27th. of 2019, who is their leading writer on human rights. I believe she's a staff writer because she appears there very, very frequently, mostly talking, writing on human rights, civil liberties, uh, also legalities, the legal aspects of impeachment, and so on. She's a very perspicacious writer, I believe, very careful writer. She says, once again, the U.S. is complicit in an illegal coup d'etat in Latin America, this time in Bolivia. On November 10th, the right wing anti indigenous group seized power after the military removed Evo Morales, the president, who had declared victory in the October 20th presidential election. The United States fingerprints are all over the coup. Advisors from the U.S. Foreign Command. Southern Command have been stationed on Bolivia's border with Argentina. Ivanka Trump made a surprising visit to an Argentine province near the border in September. The pro-U.S. Organization of American States cast unfounded doubt on Evo Morales' election victory, and the U.S.'s National Endowment for Democracy provided suspicious grants to Bolivia. These 32 people have been killed and hundreds injured since the coup began. Basacho Laurenti, who is the Bolivian ambassador to the UN, told the Democracy Now! Quote, we're going through not just a coup d'etat, but a violent one, unquote. Indeed, it has resulted in, quote, the rise of a far-right regime of terror. That was written by Professor Gabriel Hetland in the Washington Post. Evo Morales, the first indigenous leader in a country where 65% of the people are indigenous, received 10% more votes than Carlos Mesa, the second-place candidate who has close ties to U.S. government. Carlos Mesa was in regular communication with U.S. officials who were trying to destabilize Evo Morales. The U.S. government cables published by WikiLeaks reveal the day after the election, the U.S.-funded OAS sought to delegitimize the results of the election. Quote, the OAS mission expresses deep concern and surprise at the drastic and hard-to-explain change in the trend of the preliminary results that were revealed after the closing of the polls, unquote, it stated. But the CEPR, the Center for Economic and Policy Research, a U.S. think tank, published a comprehensive statistical analysis on November 8th that found no evidence of fraud or irregularities in the election and determined that the results reflected highly similar patterns from past elections. Other research conducted by CELAG, the Centro Strategico Latinoamericano de Geopolítica, confirmed CEPR's findings and identified insufficient evidence to support the assertions in the OAS statement. CEPR co-director Mark Weisbrot noted in an op-ed for MarketWatch, quote, the OAS isn't all that independent at the moment, with the Trump administration actively promoting the military coup, and Washington having more right-wing allies in the OAS than they did just a few years ago. Unquote. The OAS was established during the Cold War to prevent the proliferation of leftist governments. USAID considers OAS a critical tool in promoting U.S. interests in the Western Hemisphere by countering the influence of anti-U.S. countries such as Bolivia. The November 10th military coup led to the forced resignation of Evo Morales, who received asylum in Mexico. Right-wing politician Janine Áñez declared herself interim president, and Donald Trump immediately recognized her illegitimate claim to the presidency, even though she got only 4% of the vote. Áñez then issued a decree immunizing the military from criminal liability, quote, for carrying out necessary actions in their legitimate defense while performing their constitutional duties, unquote. Okay, and the supporters of Evo Morales accused Áñez of giving soldiers, quote, carte blanche to shoot demonstrators. Okay. The human rights ombudsman and reporters have documented widespread injuries and fatalities from gunshots. On U.S. involvement in the coup, the article says, during Evo Morales' nearly 14 years in office, his MAS movement party reduced poverty by 42% and extreme poverty by 60%. It cut unemployment by 50% and nearly tripled the per capita GDP. Quote, it's indisputable that Bolivians are healthier, wealthier, better educated, living longer, and more equal than at any time in the South American nation's history, unquote. Anthony Fiola wrote in the Washington Post. There was discontent about Evo Morales seeking a fourth term among some sectors in Bolivia who thought there should be space for new leadership. But Evo Morales had a strong record of establishing policies to help the people, which angered the U.S. government. Western corporations and the corporate media, who function as ideological shock troops against the leftist governments in Latin America, unquote. That was written by Alan McLeod at Fairness and Accuracy in Reporting, which is FAIR, the FAIR group here. The U.S. and Argentine governments helped engineer the Bolivian coup. Estela Coloni reported in Resumen Latino America. She cited the presence of advisors from the U.S. Southern Command on the Argentine border with Bolivia. Coloni also documented the surprising trip of Ivanka Trump to the Argentine province of Jujuy, near the Bolivian border. I probably murdered the pronunciation of that province, on September 4th to 5th, accompanied by 2,500 U.S. agents and Undersecretary of State John Sullivan. Ivanka Trump was ostensibly there to visit a small NGO dedicated to furthering women's rights, and she delivered an aid package of $400 million for, quote, road works, unquote. Alicia Kanki Condore, a national who is a national representative of MAS, said that it's probably Huahai. In Huahai, Donald Trump's daughter had met with Governor Geraldo Morales to plan what happened in Bolivia, unquote. That's some speculation by mass, which may well be true. Moreover, okay, according to Coloni, uh, one general in Bolivia by the name of Williams Kaliman, who suggested that Evo Morales resign after the election, traveled to the U.S. 72 hours after the coup began, and he received $1 million from the U.S. Embassy in Bolivia. Like many Latin American strongmen over the years, at least six of the top leaders in the military involved in the coup, including Kaliman, were trained at the notorious the U.S. Army School of the Americas, now called the Western Hemisphere Institute for Security Cooperation in Fort Benning, Georgia. Months before the coup, there was a 2.3 billion deal, okay, which the Bolivians concluded with the Chinese consortium to mine, okay, it's lithium. The country has 70% of the world's supply, okay, of lithium, which is used in car batteries, okay, electronic devices, and weapon systems. The idea there might be a new social compact for the lithium was unacceptable to the main transnational mining companies, said Vijay Prashad. Okay. Uh, okay. Also, Canadian and U.S. companies sought to make a lithium agreement with Bolivia, but they could not meet Evo Morales' conditions. And quote, Evo Morales himself was a direct impediment to the takeover of the lithium fields by the non-Chinese transnational firms, according to Prashad. And quote, he had to go, unquote. So that's the picture there. We wanted the lithium. We wanted it for our companies. We wanted it for our defense efforts. We used key vehicles of the United States, like the National Endowment for Democracy, the OAS, uh, as a cover for CIA activities to take down the government there. Uh, there's a quote here from one William Blum, writing in 2005 that, in effect, CIA has been laundering money through the National Endowment for Democracy. And as we move on, the grants are supposed to be for lofty objectives in the Americas, but National Endowment for Democracy was complicit in the Iran-Contra affair in the 1980s. It was also behind, the manipulation of the Nicaraguan in the Nicaraguan elections. It heavily funded the 2002 failed coup attempt against socialist president Hugo Chavez in Venezuela, and supported the opposition to progressive president Jean Bertrand Aristide in Haiti in the 1990s. Between 1990 and 1992, NED donated $250,000 to the Cuban American National Foundation, the violent anti-Castro group based in Miami. In 2018, it funneled more than 23 million to opposition groups in Latin American countries, including Venezuela, okay, and Cuba, okay, and Nicaragua and Bolivia. Former National Security Advisor John Bolton called Venezuela, Cuba, okay, Nicaragua the troika of tyranny in November 2018. A few months later, in April 2019, the U.S. government orchestrated another unsuccessful coup in Venezuela. Juan Guaido, Washington's chosen puppet to seize power from the president, okay, in Venezuela, Maduro, was funded by NED. So this is essentially just going through the history of attempts to intervene, okay, in Latin America and to overturn regimes, okay, in Latin America. The CIA is funneling money through the National Endowment for Democracy, and the State Department also engaging, okay, in those attempts. The article notes, though, okay, that U.S. complicity in the coup in Bolivia is illegal under both the U.S. and international law. The UN Charter prohibits the use of or threat to use force against territorial integrity or political independence of another nation. The International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights guarantees the right to self-determination for states. Okay, in other words, there's been a violation of U.S. law here, okay, and of international law, and that's been by the Trump administration. So Donald Trump is responsible for that, and this should be one of the articles of impeachment, okay, against him. The Foreign Assistance Act forbids the United States from assisting a country whose duly elected head of government is deposed by military coup or decree. That's certainly the Bolivian situation, okay, right here. There has been global condemnation of the coup. 64 organizations of jurists, lawyers, NGOs, social movements, and trade unions from all over the world, including the International Association of Democratic Lawyers and the National Lawyers Guild, sent a letter to the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, who is Michelle Bachelet, urging her to strongly condemn the human rights violations resulting from the coup. However, Bachelet of late has been more a tool of the U.S. than anything else. 14 members of the House of Representatives sent a letter to Secretary of State Mike Pompeo saying they were deeply concerned about the contribution of the Trump administration to the escalating political and human rights crisis in Bolivia. Over 800 scholars, activists, and public figures published an open letter demanding that the United States and the international community halt all support to the right-wing anti-indigenous regime that took power after the military coup. Veterans for Peace condemned the racist coup in Bolivia and demanded an end to U.S. intervention in Latin America. Veterans for Peace stands in solidarity with the indigenous majority in Bolivia who are resisting the racist right-wing takeover of their democracy. And by the way, it certainly is a racist right-wing takeover. There just is no doubt about that. We demand that the coup be stopped and democracy restored in Bolivia. As military veterans who've been used and abused in too many unjust wars, we demand an end to 200 years of U.S. intervention in Latin America. The situation in Bolivia is volatile, and there is danger it could devolve into civil war. This is the time to urge senators and Congress members to end all U.S. support for the illegitimate regime, demand free and fair elections with all political parties represented, and insist that fundamental human rights of all Bolivians are protected. And I could agree more. This seems like a fine and very accurate article to me. Highly accurate, certainly an honest article. that is trying to give you the true picture of what has happened there. It's very strong on background. It's just a really good article. Considering everything, I recommend that you read it. It's a touch long, but it's one of the best articles to give you the full picture there up to this point. So that ends what I wanted to go through tonight. I will now go through your comments. This has been a little on the longer side, so I hope that some of you are still hanging in. Well, you are. Surprise. Thank you for hanging in. Hi, Catherine. How are you? Kathy Langen's here. Kay Clark Ryan is here. Margot Shepard's here. Jim Bird's here. Susan Eldridge has joined. Hi again, everybody. And Kay Clark Ryan says he's the UK Bernie. Yes, he is. Jeremy Corbyn, Kay, is the UK Bernie. And by the way, those charges, Kay, of anti-Semitism, totally unjustified. There's not an anti-Semitic bone in Corbyn's body. And Juan LaChapelle has joined. Dale Weaver's joined. Catherine Class has joined. Hi again, Catherine. Rosemary Robinson has joined. Any comments, by the way? I don't see too many substantive comments here tonight. I'll entertain any comments you have. In the meantime, let me go to my reminder screen here. Please share, like, and subscribe. And please become a patron at www.patreon.com/Joe_Firestone. Thank you very much for considering that. I'll go back and see if you've got any other comments. Please share this as much as you can. Catherine says, thanks, it was great. Well, thank you, Catherine. Thank you for coming. Was a little longer than I planned. Two of these articles were quite extensive. I think they were very good articles, but they were quite extensive. Certainly. But it does give you the picture of some domestic struggles against what neoliberal is still doing here. And certainly right now Bolivia is at the center of foreign policy struggles in the developing world. Now, the Bolivian situation is just an outrage. It's an outrage we have to reverse. And I certainly hope that when Bernie Sanders is elected to the presidency, that he will certainly reverse that situation. I sincerely hope. All he really has to do is withdraw any support at all for the illegitimate regime in La Paz. And he needs to insist on fair elections with all candidates participating and all parties participating. And he needs to insist, he needs to make very, very strong statements, but to the military, that any intervention by them in the proceedings will be severely frowned upon and will end once and for all any further military aid to Bolivia until democracy is restored. Any other comments or questions? Okay, I'll wait a minute or two since I see a few more of you have arrived. Okay, I hope you all have had a good Thanksgiving. Bonnie and I had a wonderful Thanksgiving. We went over to some friend's house and we got to play with their grandchildren. I'm sorry, with their children for most of the night, who were at a younger age than our grandchildren is now. So we got to remember what it was like when we could play with our grandchildren that way. Our grandchildren are now 13, okay, and 10, and their children were 5 and 3, which of course is really an adorable age. And the kids were really energetic. Boy, were they energetic. And for roughly 2 hours after dinner, they couldn't stop moving. They couldn't stop moving. It was great fun for us. Okay, any comments? I still don't see any new comments or questions. We need to bottle their energy and sell it, says Catherine. You bet we do. You bet we do. Yeah, once we had that energy, when you're 5 and when you're 3, you can't stop moving. Well, they got us moving a little too. And that was fun. Catherine says, good night, Dr. Joe. Good night to you, Catherine. I'll be back tomorrow night, by the way. I'll be back at 9 or approximately 9 tomorrow night for another session of the In-Depth Show. And tomorrow night, I'll be talking about climate justice, the movement for climate justice and attempts to influence the Democratic Party, the public banks movement and the relationship of the public banks to the Green New Deal, the problem of existential threats to ourselves from the climate crisis, and finally, I'm going to be talking some more about the Labour manifesto in the UK elections. Again, a very important subject as well. So that's what will be going on tomorrow night. I hope to see some of you there. So please come, and I'll see you tomorrow. I'm going to say goodnight now. I've been on for nearly 2 hours, so this has been a long one.